Breaking news. The Young and the Restless spoilers. In the latest shocking episode, the camera pans across the quiet, dimly lit room where Daniel lay collapsed on the floor, motionless, his pale skin soaked in sweat and blood trickling from his mouth. His chest no longer moved, his breath absent, and the bottle of whiskey, now emptied, sat beside him like a silent witness to the horror that had unfolded. The once strong, confident Daniel was now reduced to a helpless figure crumpled in the middle of his own home, surrounded by the chaos that ensued after his fateful sip. Lucy was the first to find him. Her scream pierced through the air, raw and terrified, as she rushed to her father's side, her hands trembling as she tried to shake him awake. "Dad! Dad! Please! No!" The sight of Daniel, lifeless and bleeding, sent a wave of sheer panic through her body. Tears streamed down her face uncontrollably, her mind unable to process what was happening. Heather appeared moments later, running in from the other room, her eyes widening in disbelief at the sight before her. "Daniel!" she screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. In that moment, her brain struggled to comprehend the reality in front of her. For a fleeting second, she thought maybe he was having a heart attack, or some sudden severe illness had struck. Her hands found their way to his pulse point, pressing frantically against his neck, but there was no rhythm, no sign of life. Her heart sank as a deep, primal fear gripped her. "Call 911. Heather cried out to Lucy, her voice breaking with desperation. "We need an ambulance." Lucy fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed the number, her breath shallow as she sobbed uncontrollably into the receiver. "Please, send help. My dad, he's not breathing. I think he's dying." Her voice wavered as she tried to explain their location, her words barely coherent through her tears. Heather cradled Daniel's head in her lap, rocking back and forth, willing him to open his eyes to take one more breath. "Daniel, please. Please don't leave me," she whispered, her voice cracking. But deep down she feared the worst. The blood, the sudden collapse. It didn't make sense. What could have happened? He had been fine just moments ago. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. But to Heather and Lucy, time seemed to stretch endlessly. The sound of the ambulance was their only glimmer of hope, but even that hope was fleeting. Daniel's skin was turning cold, his body growing still, and the look in Heather's eyes was one of helplessness and devastation. "Come on, Daniel! Fight! Please, you have to fight!" Heather's voice was hoarse as she shook him gently, willing his body to respond. She didn't know what was wrong, but she couldn't accept that this was the end. Not like this. Not without a chance to say goodbye, not without a fight. The paramedics burst through the door, rushing to Daniel's side as they began their desperate attempt to revive him. They worked quickly, administering CPR, checking his vitals, all while Heather and Lucy watched in helpless horror, their world unraveling before their very eyes. The room was filled with urgency, with shouts and beeping equipment, but none of it seemed real. It was as if they were trapped in a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. After what felt like an eternity, the paramedics lifted Daniel onto a stretcher and rushed him out of the house, Heather and Lucy trailing behind in a daze. They climbed into the ambulance, their hearts pounding as the vehicle sped toward the hospital. Heather held on to Daniel's hand, squeezing it tight, praying for some kind of miracle. But deep down, a gnawing fear had already taken root inside her. As they arrived at the hospital, Daniel was whisked away into the emergency room. Heather and Lucy were left to sit in the cold, sterile waiting area, their minds racing with 1,000 unanswered questions. What had happened? Was it a stroke, a heart attack? The thought of Daniel's death seemed too surreal, too cruel. Heather glanced down at her hands, still covered in Daniel's blood, her mind flashing back to the moment she had found him. The sight of his lifeless body haunted her, and the silence of the waiting room was deafening. Meanwhile, the truth of what had happened lurked in the shadows, just out of reach. Daniel had not suffered a heart attack. He had not collapsed from illness. No, what had taken him down was far more sinister. The bottle of whiskey he had drunk from was laced with a deadly poison, a concoction so potent that even the smallest sip could have disastrous effects. And Daniel had unknowingly consumed the entire bottle. The poison was Sharon's doing. Sharon, tormented by her own demons, had poured the toxic liquid into the bottle. believing that killing Daniel would bring her the closure she so desperately sought. In her twisted mind, she had convinced herself that Daniel was responsible for Cassie's death, that he deserved to suffer for the pain he had caused. Cameron, her hallucination, her inner monster, had fed her rage, pushing her to act on her darkest impulses. Now, as she sat in her home, Sharon felt a sick, twisted sense of satisfaction. She believed she had succeeded. Daniel was gone, and with him, the weight of her torment would finally be lifted. She was free, she thought. Free from the haunting memories of Cassie, free from the guilt that had consumed her for so long. Sharon was ready to celebrate the death of the man she believed had destroyed her life. But what Sharon didn't know was that her victory would be short-lived. She had underestimated the strength of those around Daniel. The people who loved him, the people who would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. Heather and Lucy, devastated and confused, would not rest until they knew